The question of the pupil. How do we set about trying to be more conscious of ourselves? The teacher replies. To be conscious of oneself is a state of consciousness. It is a normal and natural state of consciousness proper to man. This is what we should have. We should live our lives in a state of consciousness of self. How do we set about trying to be more conscious of ourselves? First of all, we must realize that the majority of the time, if not all the time, we do not have this state. Our conclusion is, as with Gurdjieff, there is something wrong with us. We are abnormal. We are ordinary. We do not have this state of consciousness of ourselves. So the first task in trying to set about to be more conscious of ourselves is to realize we don't have this state. And this is our task here. We are abnormal. When we realize we don't have this state of consciousness of self, then how are we going to set about trying to be more conscious of ourselves? How could we possibly set about being more conscious of ourselves? Well, it seems to me there are two routes we can follow, and these correspond, in fact, to the two teachings associated with Gurdjieff. First, we can say we're going to be more conscious of ourselves and make efforts to be more conscious of ourselves. We can work on ourselves to be more conscious of ourselves. This is the Gurdjieff tradition coming from Ouspensky. Now, what are we going to do to become more conscious of ourselves? What kind of efforts can we make? We can make efforts of will, but we don't know what it is. Nor do we know what is consciousness. So how are we going to make consciousness something we don't know anything about? More by using will, again, something we don't know anything about. We can use attention. We can try to gain more attention, but we don't know what attention is. How do we have attention? We don't know anything about it. So how are we going to make more of something that we don't know anything about? These are the problems of the Gurdjieff tradition. Now, what Gurdjieff is actually teaching, and this seems to accord, in my experience, with the reality, is that consciousness of self is the state of consciousness, quite normal and natural, of our true conscious mind. Now, Gurdjieff says, at the very beginning of his writings and right through to the very end, we have two consciousnesses having nothing in common, and he says effectively that we are living in the wrong one. Now, to say that we have two consciousnesses having nothing in common can only imply, because there are two of them, that these are conscious minds. And what we find in Gurdjieff's teaching is that what Gurdjieff is claiming is that we have a true conscious mind, and the state of consciousness of this true conscious mind is the state of consciousness known as consciousness of self. We don't have to acquire consciousness of self by means of efforts on our part, because it is the normal and natural state of consciousness of our true consciousness, in the sense of our true conscious mind. What is the problem is not that we don't have consciousness of self, it is that we are living in the wrong conscious mind. We are not living in our true conscious mind. Our true conscious mind is neglected by us, has become isolated, remains in a primitive state as a result. And this is the problem. So we're not, if you can try and understand the difference between these two teachings, we are not trying to be more conscious of ourselves. We are trying to understand why it is that we are living in a false, fictitious and unreal consciousness. Why are we living in the wrong conscious mind? Because if we can figure this out, and if we can bring our true consciousness back, as it were, into the arena, then we will have consciousness of self, because consciousness of self is the normal and natural state of consciousness of our true conscious mind. So we're not trying to create in ourselves consciousness of self. If we want to be more conscious of ourselves, then we need to bring into the arena, into our lives, into our experience, our true conscious mind, because consciousness of self is the normal and natural state of consciousness of our true conscious mind. So here we start to see the difference between the two teachings associated with the name of G.I. Gurdjieff. We see the Gurdjieff tradition. We are trying to create or become more conscious, something we don't know anything about, by using willpower, something we don't know anything about, or attention, something we don't know anything about, or by trying to remember ourselves, something we can't do, or by trying to observe ourselves, something we can't do. It's impossible. What Gurdjieff is actually saying, we have two conscious minds, we're living in the wrong one, and that's why we don't have this normal and natural state proper to us of consciousness of self. The question of the pupil. How does one attain any certainty that your method is right? The teacher replies, it is not a quality of our life that we have certainty about anything. Turn this around. What does it mean to be uncertain about anything? In fact, we can be pretty sure, we can be pretty certain that some things are not true. If I say that the grass is purple, grass is purple, you are pretty certain that it's not true. And if your teacher says grass is purple, you know it's not true, and you think he must have some other reason for saying this. There must be some trickery involved here. There must be some subtlety that he's going to reveal. So, if you look at a teaching in this way, you can acquire some certainty. Because if the teacher says something that is wrong, you are looking for the trickery in what he says. You are looking for the ulterior motive. You are looking for the denouement of the trick. Why would he say something so stupid? So if you want certainty that my method is right, how do you respond to the things I say? Are you looking for some trickery in them? In your experience, is grass purple? No, so you're looking for a trick. In your experience, is what I say right? Are there elements in what I say that are correct? Look at your own experience. But if you recognize instantly that what I'm saying is not true, and are looking for the trickery, looking for the ulterior motives, looking at what I say as if it's an analogy, as if there is something else hidden there. If you're doing that, then you know that what I'm saying is not correct. It is not right. So you have to look at your own experience. You already know certainty and uncertainty. You already know whether what I'm saying is right or not. Just look at your own experience and how you respond. Are you looking for the trick? Are you looking for me to produce a rabbit out of the hat, out of what I've said? Or is what I'm saying just obvious? The question of the pupil. You have spoken of imagination. Do you mean imagining something to be true or drawing pictures? The teacher replies, there are two kinds of imagining. There is daydreaming, and there is imagination that arises out of perception. There is imagination as perception. Let's take the first case. There are teachers who will say to you that you must struggle with imagination, struggling with daydreaming, to stop daydreaming. Now, why would you want to stop daydreaming? Daydreaming is pleasant. You can daydream about pleasant and enjoyable things, or you can daydream, you can imagine, as it were, unpleasant or horrible things, and get pleasure out of that, or get a thrill out of that imagining, out of that daydreaming. What is wrong with this? There are teachers who will say, you must try to stop this. And it's good advice, but it's good advice until you ask yourself, why am I daydreaming? And one of the key features of this work is that we are dealing with energies. We are dealing with the fuel for the machine. It has been said man is a machine. Of course, it's nonsense, but it is an analogy, and we must be careful drawing conclusions from analogies, of course, but the analogy is there to suggest that if there is a function in a man, there must be a fuel for that function, and this applies to our intellectual activities, to our mind as well as to our body. It applies to our emotional life as well as to our intellectual life, as well as to our physical life, and so on. There must be the energy there to provide fuel for this activity. Now, if there is not the energy there, if the process that produces that energy is not there, then we have to seek to find some way, some other way of producing that energy. If we do not have experiences of our own sufficiently intense, as it were, to provide the energies, to transform the energies that are then utilized elsewhere in us and are, shall we say, essential elsewhere, then we have to find some other method of producing those energies. If we don't do that, then we suffer. It may be detrimental to us because we don't have the energies to do those things that we absolutely need to do to continue and to maintain our existence. So when we talk about daydreaming, when we talk about imagination, we must be very careful. Because if we imagine, if we daydream, we're not stupid people. We do it for a reason. And the reason is that we don't have enough experiences, enough activities, enough stimulation at that time to transform the energies that we need for other processes that might need to take place in us. So there is a sense in which, until we understand why we are daydreaming, why we are imagining, we must never try to stop this activity, because this is an activity that is producing or transforming energies as fuel for other processes that might be essential for us. Why else would we do it when we're not particularly stupid people? We have a reason why we do things. Now, this does not mean that daydreaming and imagination are desirable qualities. It means they are the means by which we are producing energies essential for us. But we could replace daydreaming and imagination, by genuine experiences, genuine activities, and still produce those energies in a more natural and normal way that are essential for us. So it is not a question of stop daydreaming, stop this imagination, as some would suggest, because these activities are absolutely essential to provide us with the fuel for further essential activities required that we need to do. But we can replace these by more normal and natural activities, which in turn produce those energies and may produce those energies necessary for us better, or of a better quality, or of more in terms of quantity. So it is, in terms of daydreaming, we must be very careful and not try to change anything in ourselves. Just become aware that this is what we do, and that this is actually producing the energies that should be produced by other methods, energies absolutely essential for maintaining our own existence. We must never stop daydreaming. If we want to stop daydreaming, we must replace it with more normal and natural activities that produce those energies. Now, there is another form of imagination that emerges, and let me describe to you this in my own experience in a strange way that I became aware of it, because there was a time when I was studied for a long time reincarnation, ideas of reincarnation, and during this I was a rock climber, as I've explained before, so I would often be walking quite often on my own in quite remote areas, in woodland or on moors, through forests, and at times I would have a quite strange experience, because I would place this experience, I would place this emotion, as it were, into the times of, let's say, Henry VIII. You'll think I'm a madman for saying this, but I would imagine the time I was walking through an oak forest in a remote part of the country, and I would imagine that this is imagination, I would imagine that I had lived in the past in the time of Henry VIII, or some ancient time like that, Robin Hood, Ivanhoe, and all this stuff. And when I look back, I laugh at it now. But what I became to realise is that there was a common thread, there was a common feature of those experiences. And the common thread was the presence of deer. I was in woodland, it was the presence of deer. And so I came to realise that in the presence of deer, I perceived or sensed the presence of those deer. The presence of deer in my mind was associated with ideas, picture book ideas of Robin Hood, Ivanhoe, of the Middle Ages, of living in forests. And I transformed this in my imagination into some sort of idea that I had lived in that time. I had lived in the time of Henry VIII, or before then even, of Richard and of John, King John, and that this was a process of reincarnation. So what I'm saying to you is that this was imagination, as my mind was idling as I'm walking towards my particular destination, a crag where I can go rock climbing. My mind was idling, my imagination kicked in, but my imagination was fueled by a perception, and the perception was the presence of deer. So the presence of deer was the perception, and my experience was an idea of having been reincarnated in merry old England in the past. So this is the other aspect of imagination, that imagination is a perception that we haven't quite understood. The question of the pupil. Isn't imagination self-deception? The teacher replies, self-deception is a strange word, because we can ask, is it something deceiving the self, or is it the self deceiving something? Self-deception. Either way, there are two, as it were, entities involved. What are the two entities involved? If you can answer me this question, I can better perhaps answer your question. Self-deception. What does it mean? Now there is, in Search of the Miraculous, there is a story that Ouspensky records that Gurdjieff told. It is the story of a magician who has, if I remember rightly, sheep and goats and animals. And the magician is keeping these animals, and he does not want to build fences, he does not want to spend money upon them, so he hypnotizes them. He's an evil magician. He hypnotizes them and tells them they are free. And then when the time comes, he slaughters them and eats them. And it's a story. Something like this. We can look it up and we can read it later on. But it is a story. The suggestion when you read it, of course, is that this is a story that relates to the reality. That it is real. This is what is happening in some way. Now Gurdjieff teaches by stories. But what is the connection between the story and the reality? Is there a connection between the story and the reality? Or is Gurdjieff just suggesting a picture of the reality that may be true or may be false? Suggestion is the great weakness of the three brain beings of the planet Earth, according to Beelzebub. Suggestibility, our greatest weakness. Now Gurdjieff teaches by stories. His book is the tales, the stories of Beelzebub to his grandson. Gurdjieff is teaching by stories. But what is the connection between the story and the reality? Quite often the connection is made by us. And the connection involves some sort of suggestibility, that the story has some element of reality to it, that it corresponds to the reality. But let's look at another story, for example, the story that is Beelzebub's story. Beelzebub in his youth was a very fiery and headstrong character. The various tempos of all the different functions in him were not harmonized. He was a young man. This is what happens. This is the situation. And so for the sins of his youth, he had to be exiled from the Sun Absolute and exiled to a remote corner of the universe, the solar system Ors, whose inhabitants call it simply the solar system, to the planet Mars, but with the possibility of travelling to other planets in that solar system as well. Beelzebub lives on the planet Mars, visits the planet Earth 6 times, we hear, and is eventually pardoned and allowed to return to the Sun Absolute, where, as the book says, his knowledge and experience must inevitably have been broadened and deepened. So he didn't lose out by his exile. But it's a story. But what does it mean? It means, let's take another story. Let's take you and I. Suppose we are in the Sun Absolute, and for whatever reason, some sort of fault or some feature develops in us that is undesirable. What do? We have to be exiled to a remote corner of the universe, and there, that fault, that undesirable quality, has to be removed, and then we can return back to the Sun Absolute. So we are living here on the earth, a very remote part of the universe, very hard, very tough, constant struggle. Why? So that that fault can be removed, that we can come to understand our faults, we can know ourselves, the fault can be removed, and we can return once again, pardoned, to the Sun Absolute. It's just a story. But what is necessary for us to live on the earth coming from the Sun Absolute? First of all, we must separate that faulty part of ourselves, as it were, from the rest. And so a process of division takes place. We are divided. We become multiple units, multiple functions. With plurality. Man's name is Legion. So we divide up. What else happens? We must, once we're on the earth, forget that we have been divided up. What does Gurdjieff say to Ouspensky, recorded by Ouspensky? The central feature of the being, this is nothing to do with Ouspensky's self-remembering as a state of consciousness, the central feature of the being of the ordinary man is that he cannot remember himself. The central feature of the being of an ordinary man is that he cannot remember himself. Now we take it as if, oh, it's a fault, and we should be able to remember ourselves, but that's not what it says. The central feature of our being is that we cannot remember ourselves. Why? Because if we could remember ourselves, we would understand that we are in fact faulty, that we are separated, that we are divided, that we are living on the earth, merely for the purpose of removing that fault. And we might struggle against this, we might not agree with this, we might not like this, we might want to return to the Sun Absolute. Who knows? It's a story. What else do we have to do? We have to, if we do remember parts, we have to deceive ourselves and pretend that we don't remember. We have to pretend that we don't know, self-deception. So a different story, I know it's not a very good story, it's a bit inadequate and I'm just creating it off the top of my head, but a different story presents our inability to remember ourselves in a positive light. This is a very good thing in our circumstances. It presents self-deception in a very positive light. We've got to deceive ourselves. We've got to pretend so that the faulty part, this faulty aspect of ourselves, can be revealed to us and can, in the course of time, be removed so that we can return to whence we came. So it's a story. And the story presents a particular picture that may or may not be true, it may or may not correspond to reality, but above all the story presents either a positive or a negative picture of particular features. Ouspensky presents self-remembering in a rather negative light, as if it is a state of consciousness that we don't have, and therefore we must try to obtain it. But that's not what Gurdjieff says, as far as I can tell. Gurdjieff says the central feature of the being of the ordinary man is his inability to remember himself. And it could be presented in a story in a positive light. We can't remember ourselves. One of the key features of all philosophical and religious teaching is that in entering into our lives, we forget. Self-deception can be presented in the same way as depends upon the story, in a positive light or in a negative light. So Gurdjieff teaches by stories. Whether they connect with reality is up to us to decide. In addition, the great teacher in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson is the Mullah Nasreddin, who teaches by sayings of popular wisdom. which may make sense to us and may not. They may correspond to reality, they may not. They may correspond to reality up to a point. And if we examine Gurdjieff's own sayings, we realise actually this doesn't make sense after a certain point. So Gurdjieff is teaching by stories and sayings popular wisdom. It's not an academic presentation. So self-deception, what does it mean? First of all, it implies there are at least two entities, as it were, involved, one deceiving the other. What are these entities? And is it necessarily a bad thing, or can it be presented as a very positive feature, a possibility for us for our development? The question of the pupil. Would you mind explaining what is meant by lying? The teacher replies, lying is the inability to speak straight. There is in lies an obliqueness, an angle. That's all. One can lie deliberately to obscure or hide the truth, or one can lie unconsciously, unknowingly, in an attempt to explain the truth. Our attempts to explain things are often oblique. This is a lie, but it is an attempt. There is a genuineness in it, there is a truth in it, if it is a genuine attempt to get to the truth. Lying is the inability to speak straight. When Gurdjieff says, therefore, that we live in lying, or that everyone lies all the time, this is the meaning, in my opinion, of what he's saying, that we have this inability to say the truth straight, to speak straight. Now, there is, of course, the other, more idealistic definition of lying. In every word that we can use, there is a diamond of definition. We can see the diamond, we put the word at the top, there are two sides, the two corners of the diamond, and then they unite at the bottom to create the diamond. There is a practical or physical or material side, and then there is the idealistic, transcendent, spiritual, if you like, side of the word. So lying, the practical side, we just have this inability to speak straight. It's a practical thing. We can work on it. But the other side of lying, the other interpretation of the term lying, is about intention. It's more idealistic, it's more psychological. What is the intention? So we would say that someone is lying if they are intending to deceive you in some way. But if they have a genuine desire to explain to you or to tell you the truth, but are unable to do so for practical reasons, because that's the nature of human psychology, that we can't speak straight, then that's a different thing, because their intention is to try to tell the truth. So this is the other side of lying. And I think this is a side that is ignored by Gurdjieff when he says that we are lying all the time, and by Ouspensky, who he says it's impossible to live in a world of lies. What is the intention? And when we look at the two sides of the diamond of definition, always these two sides exist in all words we use, then we can see that in this idealistic side there is a completely different definition. What is the intention? If the intention is to deceive, it is a lie. If the intention is to tell the truth and to explain the truth as it is understood, then we would speak of the truth, even though what we're saying might not correspond to the truth. Our intention is to tell the truth. So there are the two sides in every word, and you can look for these: the practical, material side, and the idealistic or transcendent or psychological side of every word. The question of the pupil. I want to know the truth that it is good for me to know in my present state. How can I discover if it is a lie? The teacher replies. Your question here is actually two questions. You want to know the truth that's good for you to know, that you need to know in your present state, and you're also asking how can you know if it is a lie. There are many things that are true that it is probably better that you do not know in your present state, because they would hinder your possibilities of developing from your present situation. So the truth that it is good to know in your present state is not a question of truth and lie. It is a question of which aspects of truth, what true information do you need now in your present state to progress in the way that you want to. The question of how can you discover it is a lie is a quite different question. I've said you can discover something is a lie because there is a reaction in you, a response in you. You do not believe it. There is an experience that tells you this is not true. The truth for you to know in your present state is the truth that you can acknowledge in your present state as a truth. It may be that something inappropriate for you that is true is told to you in your present state, but your response to that is going to be as if it is a lie. So this is a complex question. I've said earlier, that we've spoken about self-deception. Self-deception is a lie told to yourself. Why would you tell yourself a lie? So again, there is a further complication here, because it may be that the truth that you need to know in your present state in order to develop is in fact a lie. And to give an example of this, I would suggest this is an example of this. This is the teaching that is given by Ouspensky as having been given to him by Gurdjieff about essence and personality. In my opinion, this is not true. It is a very valuable teaching. It is very valuable to you in your present state, but it is not true. It is a teaching that motivates you, because it is suggesting that you have something that is your own and you have things that are not your own. And it is promoting the development of what is your own over what is not your own. But the actual teaching, essence and personality, as if you have an essence, is not correct. And certainly in the form given by Ouspensky, the idea that personality prevents the development of essence, this is, in my opinion, completely false and is not beneficial to you in your present state. It is a very damaging teaching. So it's a very complex situation, because there are truths that will harm your development as much as a lie will harm your development. And equally, there are lies that we can tell which will help your development and aid your development up to a certain point, at which point you realize that in fact they are lies. So it is a complex situation. Your development does not depend upon truth or lies. It depends upon the information that you need at the present moment in order for you to develop in the way that you want to develop. And that's irrespective of truth or lie. The question of the pupil. As regards imagination, if you are thinking instead of imagining, should you be aware of the effort all the time? The teacher replies, I have already spoken of the flow of attention in us. We have three centres. Only one of those three centres thinks. We have a thinking centre in the head. So there is a flow of attention. So for a while I start to think in my head. It may be a matter of a few seconds only. And then my attention passes to my body. I stop thinking, I forget what I was thinking about. From my body, my attention might pass to my emotional centre. I still can't remember what I'm thinking about or was thinking about. From my emotions, it passes back to the body. It may only be a matter of seconds. And then from the body, it passes again back to the head. And I remember what I was thinking about and can continue, perhaps only for a few seconds even, to think. And then my attention passes back to the emotions. I forget what I was thinking about. And then it passes back to the head. I remember again what I was thinking about and can continue my thinking until the flow of attention passes my attention back to my body again and I forget what I was thinking, and so on. This process goes on in us. It's an objective process. We can't change it. We can struggle against it, but we only struggle against it to either exhaust ourselves or to find out that this process actually exists and is objective and independent of us. So, if we are thinking, we need to use this process to allow us to think. We start to think when our attention is in the head. And then our attention flows away from the head, so we must remember that we were thinking even though we can't do it. And we must wait until our attention returns to the head and we can continue with our thinking. There's no struggle here, there is simply the effort of thinking. Fair enough. So we think only when our attention is in the head, and the rest of the time we are trying to remember that we were thinking, so that we are waiting until our attention returns to a point in the head at which we can continue our thinking. Now, imagination is different, because imagination, we start to imagine something, our attention moves from the head to the emotions. The nature of our imagination changes, because instead of being an intellectual imagination, as it were, it becomes, without us noticing it, because it's just imagination, it's just daydreaming, it becomes an emotional imagination. Our attention returns to the head, and it is again an intellectual imagination. And our attention moves to the body, it becomes a physical imagination. We imagine we are moving and we have sensations and so on. And then our attention returns to the emotional centre and so on. With imagination, it does not matter which centre. The centre will imagine according to its nature. It will be an intellectual imagination, it will be an emotional imagination, or it will be an imagination in terms of movement and sensation. It does not matter. But if we are thinking, then it is a different process, because we can only think in the intellectual centre.